This video will talk about how to design a course if your actionable learning objective has to do with understanding. Now, with all actionable learning objectives, it's important to remember that the key word there is actionable. This means that the student is doing something. It's not enough to say that they could do something if pressed. For example, if you say that students are learning about personality, well, what is it that they can do with personality now that they couldn't do beforehand? That's when we get to the actionable part. And so in this video, I want to look at understanding. Do you understand? And a student goes, yeah, I get it. The next step is, then show me. So as a teacher or as an instructor, you have to come up with ways or examples or activities that allow students to put understanding into practice. And that's what this video is all about. To give an example of this, I'd like to take a look at one of the first courses I taught in graduate school. And I'm sorry to keep going back to graduate school teaching, but it really stood out to me as significant. So I was teaching a general psychology course, and one of my peers, another graduate student, came in and listened, and she took notes. And after the course, she thought that, wow, that was great. I had a really good time. It was energetic. It was interesting. It was engaging. And she had all these really nice things to say. And the professor who was presiding over this peers visiting peers courses asked her point blank, describe the insight that you had. And so she felt put on the spot. She had just said that she had this valuable learning experience, and he was asking her to explain it. And she couldn't. She fumbled, and she ended up summarizing kind of the opposite of what, like the point that I had made. And that really stood out to me. She had had what seemed like a valuable insight, but she wasn't able to demonstrate her understanding. So it's really important to give students lots of opportunities to demonstrate something. You may have had the experience of learning about a topic, and then when it comes time to teach it, you realize you didn't learn it as well as you thought you had. That's this whole point. It takes a lot longer to really nail understanding than simply having an insight or an aha moment. So let's take a look at a couple of the general education courses at Albany State University as examples, and I've picked two learning outcomes that emphasize demonstrating understanding. Again, the word demonstrating is unnecessary, but understanding can be used as a noun and a verb that just reminds the instructor they don't have understanding. They must do this. They must perform this or demonstrate it. That's why that word is thrown in there. So the two areas in our general education program that have that actionable learning objective are Area B and Area D. Area B is split up into two subcomponents. One emphasizes diversity. That's a learning objective unique to Albany State University. Well, lots of universities use it, but that's one that the university has picked out especially for our students as an HBCU. And the other component of Area B is communication. Public speaking is a popular class in this. And then finally, Area D, these are our science labs and advanced math courses. Now remember, on the list of cognitive operations or cognitive order of operations, understanding is just below memory. So we have application beyond that, analysis beyond that, evaluation and creation falling down later on the list. So understanding isn't hyper sophisticated. It's important that students know information and then that they can use it. So it's the usefulness part. But let's go back to that actionable learning objective, understand. And so in the overview video, I look at this very briefly. Now we're going to spend some more time looking at it. In this actionable learning objective, students can, for example, give examples, interpret, they can classify, summarize, compare, and explain. So those are, let's see, 6 different examples of how demonstrating understanding can be achieved or can be carried out. If you have taught students how to give an example, or you've given them a specific example in the past, and they're able to repeat that example on an exam, they have not necessarily demonstrated their understanding. What they have done is demonstrated remembering. So all of these higher level learning objectives or actionable learning objectives can actually be memory if you're going over old material or old examples. So it's very important that when this is assessed or this is practiced, students are not simply memorizing something from before. They're not bringing past knowledge, and so all they're doing is memorizing more information. That puts us at the very lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy. I picked out a couple of illustrations that ask you, the viewer, to demonstrate understanding. So in this graph, the title of this graph, and this is from the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, I believe. I think that's what NIAAA stands for. And so the title of this is Alcohol Consumption by Age, and the graph can be interpreted by the viewer. So given that information, what does this graph tell you? How many takeaways or how many possible explanations could you give? Leaving it open-ended asks students or asks you to make interpretations that belong to you. Now, if I came in and told you or asked you, what does this graph say? And then went, nope. Anybody else? No, anybody else? This sometimes happens in the classroom. It's like fishing for a specific answer. We went over this last class, and you're asking students to remember something from before. You're not actually inviting them to interpret anything. They are not demonstrating understanding. They're demonstrating obedience and memory for facts from before. This is keeping them at a pretty low level of engagement, but asking them to interpret something. And there's many interpretations for this graph. And I'll go over a couple of them later, so some that I came up with. But my guess is you could give 10 different explanations or interpretations drawing on various potentially relevant external factors. Here is another example. It's a picture taken from the 2020 presidential debate between then President Trump and Joe Biden. And if you remember, there was a lot of mudslinging during this debate. So if you were to review the actual transcripts, you might ask a student, what effective debate strategies did each candidate use? Or what ineffective debate strategies did each candidate use? And so there isn't any one specific right answer. The instructor may have their list of what stands out to them, but by asking students to come up with an explanation or make this comparison, are they able to demonstrate what they've already learned in your class? Which this might be used for a debate course or a logic course in philosophy, or just a general writing course. Which arguments are strong arguments? Which arguments are supported? And so you're asking for explanation. Notice, I'm not telling you the answer and asking you to repeat it or memorize it. Or do you remember what NPR had to say about this? Or what New York Times or Washington Post had to say about this? That's all memory. Can you come up with those on your own? That is the action. Now that's not easy. What kinds of activities could you do throughout the course of a semester that will help students get better at this? Notice, it doesn't matter if you're comparing presidential candidates or slogans for cereal. The students are able to take that general idea of making comparisons, that actionable learning objective, and apply it to everything in their life. That will allow them or help them take their learning in the classroom to their life with things that really matter and are significant to them. So I've said this already, but let me go over it again. When students say we didn't go over this yet, a couple of things might have happened. One, they might be mistaking memory for understanding. So a student might think that, wait, you didn't tell us which strategies Joe Biden used during the presidential debate. So how am I supposed to know that? And so they'll wish that they had already received the answer in advance or beforehand and simply can apply it or remember it during the exam. But that's not asking them to demonstrate their understanding of the concepts of supporting an argument, for example. For an assessment or for an activity, it is essential that you come up with new information, a new topic, a new opportunity for them to demonstrate their understanding. All right, so let's go back to some of those earlier pictures. Here is that graph from before. What sorts of explanations might you use? Well, what stands out to you in the graph? There's this big jump, and so what might we say about that? Turning 18, becoming a legal adult, or no longer being a minor. This is often the times when children move out of the house, or young adults move out of the house. Over here, we see the lowest point of alcohol consumption, and then a little blip right here. I'm thinking like retirement age. What about social pressures in end of high school and into college? We could talk about health problems. So is this decline health related? Maybe it's metabolically motivated. There are lots of possible explanations that you can give. The purpose here isn't finding the right explanation. It's the ability to derive multiple explanations that are reasonable. That's the skill. That's the action. That's the learning objective when you're talking about demonstrating understanding. So what are some of those activities? I mentioned them earlier, but what I've done here is given short definitions of each one. So with interpreting, you're asking a student to describe something through a specific frame of reference. For example, looking back at that graph, if you're looking at this graph as a sociologist, you might look at it differently than if you're looking at it as a health psychologist or a gerontologist or even a psychopathologist looking at alcoholism. Exemplifying. This is a long word for giving an example. In order to understand a concept, students must be able to give a relevant example of that. Classifying. Using rules to categorize items. There's not only one way to categorize information, there's often multiple ways. A really simple example of that is organizing objects found in a room. Objects can be arranged in terms of size, shape, color, weight, just for simple examples. And being able to follow those rules requires understanding. Summarizing, putting something into your own words. That's why it's so important that students don't just memorize a definition. Can they put it into their own words? I have this happen all the time. A student will raise their hand and ask about a definition. I'll have them look it up. You tell me what the definition is, and they read it, and they'll mispronounce a few words because they don't really understand what they mean. Then I'll ask them, so what does that mean? And they'll say, that's what you're here for, tell me. So they want to stay at the level of memory. I won't know something unless they tell me. Realize how much of a disadvantage that puts students at for the rest of their lives. They can't know something or understand something unless they've been told it specifically, and they don't have the resources to work through that understanding themselves. So practice that in class. Comparing, identifying what items have in common or do not have in common. Inferring, going from general to specific or the reverse. And so you can come with a general rule and then see what fits into that, or if that rule is true, what must follow. That's how logic or deductive logic generally works. Or you can go the reverse direction. What can I say about the general nature of the universe by only examining these couple of experiences or these couple of objects? And finally, explaining, being able to provide a cause and effect relationship for a scenario or phenomenon. The ability to talk about linear cause, where A causes B, and A and B together cause C. So here is a tip. Ask yourself, what skills will my students need in order to accomplish these actionable learning objectives, or these actions? So in order to demonstrate their understanding of the experimental method, for example, what skills will they need to practice in class? So that might be memorizing the steps of the experimental method, keeping in mind that memorizing that isn't a very complicated task, but putting those steps into action once they've been memorized, that is getting to the actionable learning objective. What examples will be relevant to them? Sometimes it's helpful to pick examples that students have some familiarity with. And how will I know once they've accomplished these skills? That's the assessment component. And it's not easy to do, coming up with an assessment that adequately tests a student's ability to perform this action. And that's more complicated when you think that some courses have 30, 50, 70, 150, 500 students in them. How can you come up with an assessment that adequately tests those actionable learning objectives? A thought experiment that might be helpful is to ask yourself or to imagine that you're teaching a course in the topic doesn't matter, gender studies, for example. And as a general education course, it has one specific objective, which in this case is students will demonstrate an understanding of gender diversity within global society. But due to a new system-wide policy, you will only have 1 hour to accomplish your objective. You only get to spend 1 hour with students, and in that hour, you need to help facilitate their demonstration of understanding of gender diversity within a global society. How would you spend that 1 hour? What would be the most essential? So you don't have 45 hours or 52 hours or whatever the number might be. You only have 1 hour. So you can't spend 16 hours going over the history of gender diversity and differences in gender, and how the word has changed and how pronouns have changed and so on. And you only get 1 hour. You're probably only going to get one example. You're going to have to really nail that example. So what would you do? And then perhaps more importantly, what would you be asking your students to do? How will they be acting during that 1 hour? If it's about getting them to perform these actions, they need to be doing that action during the hour. And possibly the more time that they spend doing it, or the greater the proportion of time they spend doing it, the better their chances are at mastering that actionable learning objective. So if you can figure out how to spend that 1 hour, all you need to do is expand that to the entire semester. And you begin to realize, as I said during that first video, thinking about actionable learning objectives is really simple. Following through on them or executing them, that's the complicated part. But remember, all you have to do is achieve that one simple learning objective and use whatever resources might be helpful in supporting that. If a resource is superfluous, get rid of it. Only use those resources that directly support the actionable learning objective or the additional learning objectives that you have for a course.